Hey there, Golden Bears. I hope you're doing well and keeping it classy as always. Well, today we start in Module 1.4 and we pick off from where we last time talked about the Columbian Exchange and how the arrival of Christopher Columbus dramatically shifted the landscape of the New World, but also brought about influences to those taking place in Europe and Africa. Today we're going to dig down and drill down a little bit deeper into how the Spanish impacted the Mesoamerican people and what changes did that bring about. But before we do that, let me tell you a story. This takes us back to 1999, my first trip to India and Nepal. And one thing I noticed as we were traveling from village to village and town to town, our purpose was actually getting out and meeting with families and talking with them about some of my religious convictions and share with them the gospel message. And it was interesting. The responses, some through the translator, were very open, and others had this very brusque and emotional response, like, no, you need to leave and be gone. And it was later on that I discovered, a few days later, when I talked to my translator about this, he goes, well, you do need to realize that, our country was dominated by imperialistic colonial power for, over 120 years, namely England. Well, oh yeah, I kind of forgot about that. And many of them associate, Christianity with colonial and imperialism. I'm like, oh yeah, kind of forgot about that. So I have a really rather embarrassing story, part of my narrative as well in my ignorance in my earlier part of my growth. But that's kind of not where my story was going. But what I did discover as part of Nepal is that they had a caste system where the society was broken up based on tribal people groups. Now, officially, it said no, everybody was equal in Nepal. And this also played case in India, neighboring India. But in practice, in Nepal alone, there were 22 different people groups and tribal groups with 3 major tribes kind of dictating the story. And so I also noticed that as we went from village to village, that sometimes my translator would skip 3 houses and then go into a 4th house. And I finally, after about the 3rd day, I'm like, dude, what not dude, but why aren't we stopping at those other homes in between? He goes, well, they're not of my tribe. I'm like, but why does that matter? He goes, well, it's just a significant part of who we are in Nepal, and we just best not go knock on those doors. So for me, in talking about this caste system, it is going to be a segue into what we're going to be unpacking with what the Spanish brought over as part of the European heritage, this idea of a hierarchy and how the society, even in the New World, needs to be structured. And so with that, let's go ahead and dive in to our module 1.4. Our first aspect here is looking at this quote here, hopefully we'll pull up, is by a very rather famous and one of the first priests, a Dominican priest or a friar. A Dominican means that you abandon all of your worldly goods and you're there to serve others and serve God through your vow of poverty, etc. Well, if you remember in our prior lecture, we read from another priest by the name of Sepulveda, who thought it was okay to treat the indigenous people like barbarians. Let's see what Bartolomé de las Casas have to say. He says, I call the Spaniards who plunder that unhappy people torturers. The Indians are our brothers, and Christ has given his life for them. Why then do we persecute them with such inhumane savagery when they do not deserve such treatment? Now, this was letters that he had written back to his officials, his bosses in Spain, hoping that they would begin seeing that what the king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, thought was happening was this religious practice of sharing, their Catholic faith with the Indians was actually furthest from the truth. It actually became more of an inhumane act of this encomiendicism that we'll talk about here momentarily. So here you can see Bartolomé de las Casas kind of looking out upon the Mesoamericans, the native tribe people there, and treating them with dignity and respect for which they were well deserved. Today we're going to unpack how there were a lot of things taking place that the Spanish brought over and challenged and disrupted and damaged or flat out eliminated, whether it be from religious ideas to racial, ethnic, and gender class. Basically, how did the identities change both for the Europeans and for the American Indians? That's the lens of how you want to look at things as I kind of unpack things for today. Well, the first word that you need to be aware of from the Spanish is this idea of the encomienda. Encomenderos are really men who are assigned by, I guess you'd call them the governors, governors were then assigned by the king to begin leading these new areas of land. And remember, the Spanish wanted to not only do religious conversions, but they also were there to gain and extract value or resources, hence mercantilism, okay, from the land. In so doing, they put these leading men, encomenderos, in charge of kind of dictating the terms of how the land would be used. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit later with a couple of graphs for you to understand that. But in essence, this encomienda system was a way to extract wealth and labor from the Native American population there, and giving them actually very, very little in return. And this is where you see tremendous exploitation. So here is a picture of an encomendero obviously working them and working them and working them. And you see the whip there in his left hand, ready to lash out at any moment if they didn't satisfy what he deemed as the appropriate aspect to that. But we will come back to that in another moment. Well, the Spanish begin to really spread this idea that they were conquistadores. What is that word conquistador? Well, that's a Spanish word for meaning a conqueror and a vanquisher. Well, how is it that the Spanish were able to begin declaring the New World as their own? Well, this document was spread about, the Recuerdimiento, to basically say that the American Indians were to give in and respect the Spanish rule over them. This was designed partly because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, and I don't want to geek out too much because AP European history hopefully talks about, but the Treaty of Tordesillas essentially divided up the world as we knew it, okay, during this time, and half of it went to Portugal and the other half went to Spain. Spain got the New World, Portugal got the Old World and the old trading ports, with one possible exception. Portugal got to keep Brazil. And then that's what led to, we'll talk about later, about the slave movement moving into that part. And we're going to be introduced, because of this Treaty Tordesillas and these legal documents that basically say that any person or any resource is the property of Spanish, we now begin having a justification as to why the Spaniards can either enslave or have them go to work or extract the labor. Well, during this time, the Spanish began using the Bahamas as a hub. Columbus had done that in my prior lecture. You'll remember that, where he brought over like 17 boats and 1,500 men and tons of new things from horses and cows and different plants that were readily adopted into the horticulture of that region. But there was also a guy named there kind of lurking in the Bahamas as they kept sending over supplies. They then would stay there in the Bahama region, the West Indies as they called it, for months at a time, getting their horses acclimated, getting their soldiers acclimated, getting them a chance to regain their strength. And then Hernan Cortez in 1519 basically left the Bahamas and just sailed across the Gulf of Mexico into this town called Veracruz. And it is there in Veracruz that he did some interesting things. He, first of all, his I guess soldiers / sailors on his crew were on the cusp of mutiny. What did he do to handle the mutiny? He burned the boats. He's like, well, you can't go back now. You might as well move forward and help me conquer things there. The second thing that he did, he discovered that there was a gal named Malintzin just up the town north of him that spoke Nahuatl and Nahuatl language, which was the Aztec language, and she was also learning Spanish. How did she begin learning Spanish? Because there was a Spanish slave who was captured and kept by a local native tribe there 3 years prior, who they were allegedly coming to, escape and get out. Well, he had been teaching Malintzin Spanish. Well, how convenient. We now have a gal who can be used to act as a translator between the Aztec and the Mayans, primarily the Aztecs, and those of Hernan Cortés. Well, this is where the trickery comes in by Hernan Cortés. He marches, so let me, go in and I want to show you a picture of Malintzin right there. Take a look at that, and there you have the Moctezuma on the left-hand side, and you have Hernan Cortés to the right. And take a look at his Hernan Cortés's eyes should be white there. I'm going to talk about that in a subsequent picture, but you can't barely see it. But right over here is this baby here, this mestizo baby. Who is this, carrying him, the baby? Well, this is where Malinche is. And why the eyes blue? Because that's the baby coming from, some claim that this is Hernan Cortés, the first offspring of the mestizo people. There's a lot going on here, and I'm going to in class talk more about this in greater detail. But this Malinche, interestingly enough, and I'm geeking out a little too much on her, she was the official trader. And in Spanish, if I'm not mistaken, the Malincenquero is a person who actually is considered a trader. So they've taken her name and converted it into actually meaning something in modern day Spanish of what she was to her people, a trader. But I also find, ironically, that the Mexican culture, the Mexico, they have this day of the race, Dia de la Raza, which is what? Celebrating the race. What is this race? The mestizo race that is part Spanish and part indigenous people groups. That's a new blend. So anyhow, I'm geeking out a little too much for you, but here's a document that we'll talk about in there. But here you can see the posture of Montezuma bringing these gifts. Now this bloodthirsty Hernan Cortés that is gold thirsty as well is sitting there. Look at, they're both pointing. We don't know what they're pointing at. Maybe they're directing him, saying, if you don't relent, or else we will bring in our soldiers. What Montezuma does not know is that Hernan Cortés has already gone around and found out that there are other local city-states of Aztec, what do you call them? I guess they would be their enemies. Remember, Aztecs conquered vast groups of people groups all along, up and down the coast and in the interior. Well, these people groups were none too happy to help anybody else to get rid of the Aztecs. And so there were close to 20,000 of them that they allegedly were in the waiting for that. So like, hey, you better do this or else. But take a look at all this gold sitting there. The things that Hernan Cortés is coming for. These here are pavo real. What do we call pavo real? In English, that would be the peacock. Okay, can you imagine seeing the peacock for the first time? How magnificent. And this gold that just distributed out like little Pez candy there. Everything has been proven true. And this is where Hernan Cortés then begins coming up with the plan. They're invited to chill there in the great city of Tenochtitlan. And while they're chilling there for a few months, they're becoming more and more kind of aggressive towards their hosts. The hosts are like, yo, dude, we think something wrong is going on here. They forcibly send them out. And 2 years later, we have Hernan Cortés returning, I think it's 1521 or so, with a bunch of reinforcements, and to discover that already the viruses and the diseases that have been brought over have begun taking a toll on the people. And it didn't take long, but eventually the Aztecs were defeated, and Hernan Cortés is now the true emperor of this new region of Mexico. And he never plans to return, and never did, to Spain to kind of share all that had happened. I'm skipping these things because we're going to go over those in class. Let's go on to the third thing. So now we have Hernan Cortés and the Spanish people definitely colonizing and beginning to rule things. And so what did they do is they began setting up systems that I talked about earlier, a caste system, where you had the church kind of people at the top, then you had the warrior class, and so then you had the people who were Spain, but who were born with different types of parents, mestizos. So taking a look at this hierarchy determined who was of greatest value down to who was the least value, and who would be given the best government jobs to those who wouldn't be given but menial labor. This was the system that was employed by Hernan Cortés and anyone else who followed him as they began kind of developing other parts of Mexico, well, modern-day Mexico, Mesoamerica, during this time. So this encomienda system, what did this do? Well, it only brought nothing but pain and sorrow and suffering to the Native American people groups. Okay, so now we've given them these diseases. Now we're beginning to force them to work tremendous labor to extract the gold. We're talking down in the Inca region near Cusco, where they're extracting silver. We have hundreds of thousands there that are working to extract the silver. You have gold being extracted from different parts around Mexico City by the hundreds of thousands. And so this wealth is being sent back as resources, okay, that increasingly gives Spain tremendous power and tremendous influence politically, and transforming Europe. Sadly, because there's so much gold and silver coming into Spain and into Europe, inflation almost goes up 500%. Crazy because of this. So yeah, this is an interesting thing. Sidebar, when the government begins giving out kind of free money to families because of hardships, etc., just like we had during the COVID years, some families got it close to $7,000. Well, that $7,000 could cause inflation, whether it be from gasoline to milk to eggs to a lot of everyday staples. And so can you imagine when you have all this easier money coming in, 500%? That's a crazy thing to think about. Here's a cool picture I found in terms of what was the encomienda system. It's the plan and the reality. The plan is to settle, protect, care, kind of be this kind, benevolent keeper of them, share with them your Christian faith. In return, the Indians will work for a portion of time for the Spanish settlers. A portion of time, right? Well, what was it in reality? They forced them to labor, gave them horrible treatment, failed to protect, and seized most of their lands from them. What then resulted? Reality is they died from harsh treatment and disease. So this encomienda system only came to an end because we began seeing priests like Bartolomé de las Casas and Indian revolts beginning to occur more and more to kind of create a little, I don't want to call it equitable, but at least a better system than what the encomienda system was doing. I'll talk about this in class as well. So finally, we're going to shift our little bit of energies from Mexico City or the Mayans or the Incas and the wealth that the Spaniards had brought. And we're going to focus on this area called New Mexico, which has this Rio. It's this kind of a very famous valley that comes off the western slopes of the Colorados, and the water drains into this valley. It's where the Colorado River basically begins. And this is where, and I talked about this in 2 prior lectures, where corn is brought up to the Pueblo people, and is there that they begin to irrigate and develop a society. Well, these missionaries, these Jesuit missionaries, very similar to what happened in California, started founding missions there. And so with genuine desire, they went to bring about the message of Catholicism and to bring about conversion to them. And you can see thousands of them, local and native Indians, came to know who in the Catholic faith there. However, it was the Spanish that began demanding tributes from them economically. So it isn't really the encomienda system, but they were certainly forcing a bribe from them to say they're protecting them from outside invaders, etc. One such person in 1598, Juan de Oñate, was a bad, evil guy. He came in and with his 500 men began seizing all sorts of things, harassing the town, taking it over, and he did all sorts of horrific things. And in fact, any man who was left after this battle that took place, he cut off any man that was over 25 years of age. He cut off one of their feet, so they knew they couldn't hobble away fast. And anyone younger than that was forced to work in the fields, etc. So it was a definitely horrific experience for what had happened during that time. And this is what kind of enabled the Spanish to return a little bit to this area, but it did not last long because there was going to be one that followed this, that by 1680, the Pueblo peoples, the Native Americans at the time, had enough. And so they had a Pueblo revolt. Please know this, that so often the textbooks would always say, these Mesoamericans or these Native Americans are so passive during the initial stages. No, the Aztecs wanted to lead a revolt. Here's another example. The Pueblo people were leading a revolt. There were revolts down in Cusco as well in the mines there. But this Pueblo revolt is probably one of the more famous ones that you need to be mindful of. So with that, and to conclude, the Spanish came to conquer, yet they also did it with the mindset that we're going to have a sword in one hand and the Bible in the other hand. And boy, is that not two incongruent thoughts, especially in the relationship to what Jesus had taught about and what the Bible reflects upon. Yet those were the main ideas that were happening. Spain during this time brought in this encomienda system that was basically about economics and control of the people, and they used the caste system to further classify how society was to be structured. Still, there are parts of Mexico that see things in that same light, and I wish I had more time to talk about that, but alas, I don't. And lastly, we do have harsh treatment of the Native Americans there, but please do not forget that it was the Pueblo revolt and their poor treatment that caused many of the Spanish to go, ooh, we might have ourselves a problem here, and that then is going to cause Spain to respond. And we'll speak about this response a little bit later on in another time period as they go into Florida, as they go into expansion in trying to keep the French out along the Mississippi and New Orleans, etc. So anyhow, we hope to see you back in class soon, and we'll pick up here with some of these primary sources, but keep it classy. Go Bears.